The Great Hall of the Galactic Council stood empty where Ambassador Taeho Kim once sat. His chair remained pushed back as if he had just stepped away for a moment, but 3 months had passed since any human walked these corridors. Counselor. Veltara of the Serpentine Republic adjusted her scales and looked at the vacant spot with satisfaction. The humans were finally gone, and the galaxy could return to proper order. The massive station called Harmony's Edge spun slowly in the void, between star systems. Inside its gleaming walls, representatives from 47 different species gathered for their monthly assembly. The air recyclers hummed with a dozen different atmospheric requirements while translation devices buzzed constantly to convert thousands of languages into something everyone could understand. Yet for the first time in nearly 200 years, no human voices joined the cacophony. Veltara remembered the last time she saw Admiral Bo-Ram Lee. The human woman had stood at attention during the final security briefing, looking tired in that peculiar way humans did when they carried heavy thoughts. Her dark eyes had swept the room once before she saluted and walked away. Nobody knew it would be the last time they would see any human in the council chambers. The disappearance had been complete and mystifying. One day human ships patrolled the outer sectors and human scientists worked in their laboratories. The next day, their vessels sat empty in docking bays, and their research stations fell silent. No distress calls, no messages, no explanations. The humans had simply vanished as if they had never existed at all. Dr. Hyejin Park had been in the middle of presenting her findings on quantum field manipulation when the silence began. Her research team had been working on something they called Project Shield, but the details remained locked in computer systems that no other species could access. Her laboratory still contained half-finished experiments and coffee cups sitting exactly where she had left them. The coffee had long since grown cold and moldy, but nobody dared to clean it away. Counselor Kyneth clicked his mandibles thoughtfully as he reviewed the reports. His insectoid species prized logic above all else, and the human departure made no logical sense. Humans were curious creatures who asked endless questions and poked their noses into every corner of the galaxy. They did not simply leave without explanation. Something about their absence felt wrong, but he could not identify what troubled him. The Galactic Council had tried every method of communication they possessed. They sent ships to Earth only to find the planet's orbital defenses still active, but no response to hails. The blue world continued its rotation around its yellow star, but the cities showed no signs of life. Landing parties found homes and offices, exactly as their occupants had left them. Meals sat unfinished on tables. Vehicles remained parked in orderly rows. Children's toys lay scattered in playgrounds where no children played. The human colonies scattered across the galaxy told the same strange story. Mining stations on distant asteroids hummed with automated systems but contained no miners. Agricultural worlds showed perfectly maintained crops that grew untended. Even the massive shipyards above Kepler 442b continued their work under robotic supervision, while the humans who had designed them were nowhere to be found. Veltara had never liked humans. They were too emotional and unpredictable for her taste. They asked uncomfortable questions during council sessions and always seemed to involve themselves in conflicts that did not concern them. When the Zephyrian trade wars threatened to spill into neutral space, the humans had insisted on mediating despite having no stake in the outcome. When the plague struck the Gossamer Collective, the humans had rushed medical aid to worlds they had never even visited. Such behavior struck her as wasteful and illogical. The other council members shared similar views, though few expressed them as openly as Veltara. The humans were useful but troublesome. They possessed advanced technology and impressive military capabilities, but they used these gifts in ways that often frustrated their allies. Human commanders would disobey direct orders if they believed civilian lives were at risk. Human diplomats would spend weeks negotiating agreements that other species could settle in hours. Human scientists would share their discoveries freely. instead of using them as bargaining tools. Now that the humans were gone, many council members expected life to become simpler. Trade agreements could be negotiated without human representatives demanding complex humanitarian clauses. Military actions could proceed without human officers questioning every decision that might result in casualties. Scientific research could advance without human researchers insisting on extensive safety protocols that slowed progress. The first few weeks after the disappearance had indeed seemed quieter. The council chambers echoed less with fewer voices, debating every proposal. Ships moved through space without human patrol vessels constantly scanning for signs of trouble. Communications networks carried lighter traffic without the endless stream of human messages requesting updates on various humanitarian missions. But subtle changes began to appear that few noticed at first. Trade routes that had functioned smoothly for decades started experiencing delays and complications. Shipping companies reported increased losses to pirates in sectors where such attacks had been rare. Several worlds complained that their ecological monitoring systems were producing warnings they did not understand. The translation software that allowed different species to communicate had developed strange glitches that made conversations difficult. Veltara dismissed these problems as minor, growing pains. The galaxy had functioned for millions of years before humans evolved, and it would continue long after their disappearance. Other species would adapt to fill whatever roles the humans had abandoned. The Council would find solutions to any challenges that arose. She did not yet realize that the humans had not abandoned their roles. They had been quietly fulfilling responsibilities that no other species even knew existed. In research stations hidden throughout the galaxy, human scientists had been monitoring cosmic phenomena that threatened all life. In diplomatic offices that appeared to handle routine paperwork, human negotiators had been preventing conflicts before they could begin. In military command centers that seemed to coordinate simple patrol routes, human strategists had been tracking threats that moved in the darkness between stars. The humans had not left because they were angry or offended. They had not departed because they found better opportunities elsewhere. They had vanished because they had detected something approaching that would require their complete attention to stop. Something so dangerous that they could not risk involving other species in what might be their final mission. But the Council did not know this yet. They sat in their great hall and congratulated themselves on being free from human interference. They made plans for a galaxy without human complications. They looked forward to a future where logic and efficiency would replace human emotion and unpredictability. They had no idea that the humans had gone to face the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. They did not understand that every system the humans had built and every protocol they had established had been designed to protect other species from horrors they could not imagine. They could not see that the quiet efficiency they now enjoyed was the result of human sacrifice they had never appreciated. The empty chair where Ambassador Tae-ho Kim once sat seemed to watch them with invisible eyes. Soon they would learn that some silences carry more weight than any words ever could. The first sign of trouble came from the Outer Rim territories, where Captain Dongwoo Shin had once led regular patrol missions. The merchant vessel Bright Fortune sent a distress signal that crackled through space for 3 days before anyone responded. By the time Galactic security forces arrived, they found only debris and empty cargo containers floating in the void. The pirates had taken everything of value and left no survivors to tell their story. Veltara reviewed the incident report with growing irritation. Such attacks had been almost unknown in the Outer Rim for over 50 years. The human patrol fleets had maintained such regular sweeps through those sectors that criminal organizations had learned to avoid them entirely. Now with the humans gone, the pirates were becoming bold again. She made a note to increase security patrols, but when she checked the available resources, she discovered a problem. The Council fleet was already stretched thin covering responsibilities that human ships had previously handled. 3 weeks later, another merchant ship disappeared. Then 2 more in the same sector. The pattern was always identical. Ships would vanish without warning and be found days later stripped of their cargo. with no trace of their crews. The pirates seemed to know exactly when and where to strike for maximum effect. Veltara ordered additional patrols, but the attacks continued to increase. Engineer So-Young Choi had designed the automated systems that managed trade routes throughout the galaxy. Her elegant algorithms had balanced supply and demand across thousands of worlds while optimizing shipping times and fuel consumption. The system had worked so smoothly that most species forgot it required constant adjustment and maintenance. Now those same algorithms were producing increasingly strange results. Ships found themselves directed to empty stations where no cargo waited. Colonies received supplies they had not ordered while urgent requests went unfilled. The automated pricing systems began fluctuating wildly as they struggled to adapt to conditions their programming had never anticipated. Merchant captains complained that routes which had been profitable for decades were suddenly losing money for reasons nobody could explain. The council appointed a committee to investigate the trade problems, but the committee soon discovered that Engineer So-Young Choi had been the only person who truly understood how the system worked. Her documentation was thorough, but written in technical language that assumed knowledge no other species possessed. Attempts to modify the algorithms only made the problems worse. Minho Jiang had been one of thousands of human traders who moved goods between worlds. His ships had carried everything from rare minerals to medical supplies along routes that connected the most remote colonies to major trade centers. He had known which worlds needed what resources and when they needed them. He had understood the complex web of relationships that kept commerce flowing smoothly across the galaxy. Without traders like Minho, the smaller colonies began to suffer shortages of essential goods. Medicines that prevented common diseases became scarce on worlds that could not afford premium shipping rates. Agricultural equipment broke down on farming planets that could not obtain replacement parts through normal channels. Industrial worlds found themselves unable to export finished products because the specialized transport services they relied upon had vanished with their human operators. The medical crisis emerged slowly at first. Dr. Hai-Jin Park had been working on treatments for diseases that affected multiple species, but her research had been interrupted at a critical stage. The preliminary results showed promising treatments for conditions that had plagued certain alien populations for generations. Her laboratory contained detailed notes and experimental data, but the work required intuitive leaps that seemed beyond the abilities of researchers from other species. The Gossamer Collective was the first to request emergency medical assistance. A plague that had been controlled for decades suddenly returned with mutations that existing treatments could not handle. The human medical protocols that had contained previous outbreaks were no longer effective against the new strains. Without Dr. Hai-Jin Park and her team to develop new treatments, the death toll began to climb rapidly. Similar medical emergencies appeared on other worlds. The Centauri colonies reported birth defects that human genetic therapy had previously prevented. The silicon-based species of Kepler 442c suffered from a mineral deficiency that human biochemists had learned to treat, but nobody else understood. Requests for medical aid flooded the council chambers, but they had no experts who could replace the human specialists who had vanished. Counselor Kyneth began to notice patterns that disturbed his logical mind. Every crisis that emerged could be traced back to some human contribution that had been taken for granted. The humans had not simply participated in galactic civilization, they had become essential to its basic functioning in ways that nobody had realized until they were gone. He started investigating human activities more carefully, and what he discovered shocked him. The humans had been involved in thousands of small projects that seemed routine, but proved to be critically important. They had designed backup systems for major infrastructure networks. They had trained local specialists in essential skills that no other species had bothered to learn. They had created redundancies and safeguards that prevented cascading failures when problems occurred. The environmental monitoring systems that protected inhabited worlds from natural disasters had been developed primarily by human scientists. These systems watched for solar flares that could damage orbital stations and tracked asteroid movements that might threaten planetary populations. They monitored atmospheric changes that could indicate ecological collapse and detected seismic activity that warned of volcanic eruptions. Without human oversight, these systems began to malfunction in subtle ways. Warning signals went unrecognized because their operators did not understand what they meant. Maintenance schedules were ignored because nobody knew how important they were. Critical updates were delayed because the human experts who had designed them were no longer available to implement improvements. The first environmental disaster struck the mining colony on Vega Prime. The atmospheric processors that maintained breathable air began producing toxic gases that the automated systems failed to detect. By the time the colonists realized something was wrong, 300 people had died from poisoning that proper monitoring would have prevented. The investigation revealed that the safety protocols Dr. Ji-Eun Kong had installed would have caught the problem within hours, but nobody else had understood how to operate them correctly. Veltara found herself working 18-hour days trying to coordinate responses to problems that seemed to multiply faster than they could be solved. The humans had made everything look easy, but without them, the basic functions of galactic society were falling apart. She began to suspect that the human departure had not been random, but she could not imagine what would cause an entire species to abandon their homes and responsibilities. The communication networks that connected thousands of worlds across the galaxy had been designed with human efficiency principles that prioritized reliability over speed. The systems included multiple backup pathways and automatic rerouting protocols that ensured messages would reach their destinations even if primary channels failed. But these backup systems required constant maintenance and adjustment that human technicians had provided without fanfare. As the maintenance backlog grew, the communication delays became longer and more frequent. Messages that should have taken hours to transmit began requiring days or weeks to reach their destinations. Emergency communications were lost entirely when routing systems failed to find alternative pathways. The real-time coordination that galactic civilization depended upon was slowly breaking down. The Council called emergency sessions to address the mounting crises, but their debates accomplished little. Each species blamed others for problems they could not solve independently. The elegant cooperation that had characterized galactic society for generations was deteriorating into finger-pointing and recrimination. Without human diplomats to mediate disputes and find compromise solutions, the Council found itself paralyzed by internal conflicts. Veltara finally admitted to herself what she had been trying to deny. The humans had not been troublesome interferers who complicated simple situations. They had been the invisible foundation that held galactic civilization together. Their emotional decision-making had somehow produced better results than the cold logic other species preferred. Their tendency to involve themselves in every problem had prevented small issues from becoming major catastrophes. The galaxy was discovering that it needed the humans far more than the humans had ever needed the galaxy, but this realization came too late to change anything. The humans were gone, and their absence was creating problems that no other species knew how to solve. The very qualities that had made humans seem annoying and unpredictable had also made them indispensable in ways nobody had understood. The empty spaces where humans once worked grew more noticeable each day as their absence created larger holes in the fabric of galactic society. Soon those holes would become cracks that threatened to tear everything apart. The ecological disaster on Proxima Centauri b happened so quickly that the colonists barely had time to evacuate. Dr. Ji-Eun Kong had been monitoring the planet's fragile ecosystem for decades, and her research stations had been tracking subtle changes in ocean chemistry that indicated an approaching crisis. The automated systems she had designed were still functioning, but without her expertise to interpret their warnings, the colonists ignored the danger signals until it was too late. The algae blooms that poisoned the atmosphere could have been prevented with simple chemical treatments that Dr. Ji-Eun had developed years earlier. Her detailed protocols sat unused in computer files while toxic gases spread across the planet's surface. 2 million colonists fled to orbital stations where they waited for rescue ships that were already overwhelmed with refugees from other failing worlds. Counselor Kyneth studied the evacuation reports with growing horror. This was the 7th ecological catastrophe in 2 months, and each one followed the same pattern. Human scientists had been quietly monitoring environmental conditions and implementing protective measures that prevented natural disasters from becoming extinction events. Without their constant vigilance, the galaxy's inhabited worlds were becoming death traps. The situation on Kepler 438b was even worse. Commander Wu Jin Park had coordinated disaster response teams that could deploy within hours of any emergency. His logistics networks had positioned supplies and equipment throughout the galaxy so that rescue operations could begin immediately when disasters struck. Without his organizational genius, the response times had increased from hours to weeks. When the supervolcano on Kepler 438b began showing signs of activity, the warnings were clear enough, but the response was catastrophically slow. The evacuation, plans that Commander Wu Jin had developed, required precise coordination between multiple agencies and species. Without his leadership, the rescue effort became a chaotic mess of conflicting orders and delayed decisions. 3 cities were buried under ash before the first rescue ships arrived. Veltara received urgent reports from 12 different star systems where similar problems were escalating beyond control. Floods on agricultural worlds were destroying crops that fed billions. Seismic activity on industrial planets was threatening manufacturing centers that produced essential goods. Solar flare activity was damaging communication satellites faster than they could be replaced. Every emergency required expertise that only humans had possessed. The medical situation had become a galactic crisis. Dr. Sunmi Yoon had been developing treatments for genetic disorders that affected multiple species, but her work had been interrupted at a critical stage. The experimental therapies she had been testing showed promise for curing diseases that had killed millions over the centuries. Her research notes were detailed, but they required intuitive understanding of biological processes that other species seemed unable to grasp. The plague that swept through the Andorian system was a mutated strain of a virus that human doctors had contained easily for decades. The standard treatments had no effect on the new variant, and without human medical expertise, no other species could develop effective countermeasures. The death toll reached 500,000 before the plague burned itself out by killing most of its potential hosts. Kyneth discovered classified archives that revealed the true scope of human contributions to galactic society. His security clearance allowed him access to diplomatic records that painted a picture of human involvement far beyond what anyone had imagined. In the past 50 years alone, human negotiators had prevented 17 major wars through quiet diplomacy that had gone largely unnoticed by other species. Ambassador Young Sik Han had been mediating a territorial dispute between the Crystalline Assembly and the Void Dancers that had threatened to escalate into open warfare. His patient negotiations had been close to producing a peaceful resolution when the humans vanished. Without his diplomatic skills, the two species had already begun mobilizing their fleets for what promised to be a devastating conflict. The archives contained thousands of similar cases where human intervention had prevented conflicts. Before they could begin, human diplomats had a talent for understanding the emotional needs of different species and finding solutions that satisfied everyone involved. They could recognize when wounded pride was more important than economic advantage, and when symbolic gestures carried more weight than material concessions. Without human mediators, the old tensions between species were resurging with dangerous intensity. Trade disputes that had been settled amicably for decades were becoming sources of bitter conflict. Border disagreements that human negotiators had managed to contain were threatening to explode into violence. The delicate balance of galactic politics was collapsing without the steady hand of human diplomacy. The communication breakdown was accelerating as critical infrastructure failed faster than it could be repaired. Captain Jae-won Lee had designed the quantum relay networks that carried messages across interstellar distances in real time. His engineering teams had built redundancies into every system and created self-repairing protocols that could handle most routine problems automatically. But the quantum relays required constant calibration to maintain their delicate resonance frequencies, and without Captain Jae-won's expertise, the networks were slowly falling out of sync. Messages were arriving, corrupted or not at all. Emergency communications from disaster zones were lost in transmission delays that stretched into weeks. The rapid coordination that modern civilization required was becoming impossible. The economic collapse followed inevitably from the breakdown of transportation and communication systems. Trade routes that had functioned profitably for centuries were no longer viable. Colonies that depended on imported goods faced shortages of everything from food to industrial equipment. Manufacturing centers that produced goods for export found themselves cut off from their markets. Minho Jang had understood the complex web of economic relationships that kept goods flowing efficiently throughout the galaxy. He had known which worlds produced surpluses of which resources and which colonies needed those resources most urgently. His trading networks had balanced supply and demand across thousands of worlds while generating profits that supported millions of jobs. Without traders like Min Ho, the economic system was fragmenting into isolated markets that could not support advanced civilization. Worlds that specialized in producing specific goods were unable to trade their products for the resources they needed to survive. Industrial colonies that had abandoned agriculture were facing famine as food imports became unreliable. Velterra found herself presiding over the slow collapse of everything she had taken for granted. The efficient systems that had made galactic civilization possible were breaking down one by one as the human contributions they depended upon were revealed. Each new crisis exposed another area where humans had been essential but invisible. The military situation was equally disturbing. Admiral Bo-Ram Lee had coordinated defense strategies that protected the galaxy from threats that most species never knew existed. Her intelligence networks had tracked pirate movements and terrorist activities across dozens of star systems. Her patrol routes had been designed to maximize coverage while minimizing the resources required for effective security. Without Admiral Bo-Ram's strategic oversight, the galaxy's defenses were becoming dangerously porous. Pirates operated with increasing boldness as they learned that response times had increased dramatically. Terrorist organizations that had been suppressed for decades were rebuilding their capabilities, while security forces struggled to adapt to new responsibilities. The council meetings had devolved into desperate attempts to manage crises that appeared faster than solutions could be implemented. Representatives who had once complained about human interference now begged for any information about where the humans had gone and when they might return. The species that had voted to reduce human influence in galactic affairs were now discovering that human influence had been the only thing keeping civilization from collapse. Kyneth presented his findings to a council session that received them in stunned silence. The evidence was overwhelming that humans had been far more important to galactic society than anyone had realized. They had not been annoying interferers who complicated simple problems. They had been essential problem solvers who prevented small issues from becoming catastrophic failures. The human tendency to involve themselves in every situation had created a safety net that protected other species from the consequences of their own limitations. Human emotional decision-making had somehow produced better outcomes than the logical approaches other species preferred. Human willingness to sacrifice their own interests for the greater good had held galactic civilization together. But this knowledge came too late to help. The humans were gone, and their absence was creating a cascade of failures that threatened to destroy everything they had helped to build. The galaxy was learning that it had been utterly dependent on a species it had never properly appreciated. The very qualities that made humans seem primitive and illogical had also made them indispensable in ways that more advanced species could not replicate. The Council authorized the largest search operation in galactic history to find any trace of where the humans had gone. Admiral Zeth Kara of the Void Dancers commanded a fleet of 300 ships that spread across known space looking for clues about the human disappearance. Every abandoned colony was searched again. Every space station was examined with instruments sensitive enough to detect the smallest traces of recent activity. What they found was more disturbing than what they did not find. On the research station orbiting Wolf, 359 Dr. Sunmi Yoon had left behind experimental equipment that defied understanding. Her laboratory contained devices that seemed to manipulate space-time itself in ways that current physics said were impossible. The energy readings from her experiments suggested she had been working on something that required power levels typically associated with stellar engineering. The final log entries from her research team painted a picture of desperate urgency. Dr. Sunmi had discovered something that required immediate action, but her notes were written in technical language that assumed knowledge no other species possessed. Her references to dimensional instabilities and quantum cascade failures meant nothing to the scientists who tried to interpret her work. Captain Jae-Won Lee had been exploring the galactic rim with a survey fleet that specialized in mapping unexplored regions. His ships had been investigating anomalous readings in deep space that seemed to indicate the presence of artificial structures far beyond the boundaries of known civilization. The survey data his team had collected showed gravitational distortions that suggested massive objects moving through empty space. The last transmission from Captain Jae-Won's expedition had been received 6 months before the human disappearance. His report mentioned contact with something he described as entities that existed partially outside normal space-time. The message was fragmentary and difficult to understand, but it conveyed a sense of urgency that had prompted immediate consultation with Earth's highest military authorities. Counselor Kyneth coordinated the investigation with methodical precision that his species was known for. He cataloged every piece of evidence and cross-referenced all available data to create a timeline of human activities in the months before their departure. The pattern that emerged suggested the humans had been preparing for something catastrophic that they believed required their complete attention. Hidden research facilities throughout the galaxy revealed the scope of human preparation for unknown threats. On remote asteroids, human scientists had been developing weapons technology that seemed designed to fight enemies unlike anything in known space. The energy requirements for these weapons were enormous, and their effects would be visible across multiple star systems when deployed. Ambassador Young-Sik Han had left behind diplomatic messages that were sealed with encryption only the Council leadership could access. When Veltara finally decoded these files, she discovered warnings about cosmic phenomena that threatened all life in the galaxy. The ambassador had tried to explain the danger to other species, but had been unable to make them understand the urgency of the situation. The diplomatic archives revealed that humans had been attempting to organize a joint response to the approaching threat for over a year before their departure. Ambassador Young-Sik had presented evidence to closed council sessions that was dismissed as speculative and alarmist. Other species had been unwilling to divert resources to address a danger they could not see or understand. The encrypted messages contained references to previous civilizations that had vanished without explanation. Human archaeologists had discovered evidence of advanced societies that had disappeared completely from regions of space that were now empty. The pattern suggested that something had been systematically destroying galactic civilizations for millions of years. Dr. Ne Young Song had been leading a team of physicists who were developing defensive technologies based on principles that seemed to violate known laws of physics. Her research notes described experiments with quantum barriers that could isolate entire star systems from outside interference. The energy requirements for such barriers would consume the output of multiple suns, but the humans had been willing to attempt even impossible solutions. The search teams discovered massive construction projects in remote star systems where humans had been building structures whose purpose was unclear. These installations required resources that could have supported entire civilizations, but the humans had diverted them to projects that other species considered wasteful. The scale of these constructions suggested that the humans had been preparing for war against enemies with capabilities far beyond normal understanding. Admiral Boram Lee had repositioned human military forces throughout the galaxy in patterns. That made no sense to traditional strategic thinking. Her fleets had been moved to locations that seemed tactically insignificant, but formed geometric arrangements that spanned thousands of light years. The positioning suggested she had been preparing to defend against threats that could attack from directions normal defenses could not cover. The military archives revealed that human forces had been training for scenarios that other species considered impossible. They had practiced fighting enemies that could manipulate space-time and developed tactics for battles that might last across multiple dimensions. Their weapons development had focused on technologies that could affect targets existing partially outside normal reality. As the investigation continued, Veltara began to understand that the humans had not abandoned the galaxy. They had detected a threat so dangerous that they chose to face it alone rather than risk involving other species in what might be a hopeless battle. The human departure had been an act of protection rather than abandonment. The evidence suggested that something was approaching from outside the galaxy that had destroyed previous civilizations with effortless ease. The humans had somehow detected this threat while other species remained unaware of the danger. Rather than try to explain what they had discovered, the humans had chosen to confront the enemy themselves. Communication attempts with human colonies in distant galaxies revealed that the disappearance had been coordinated across vast distances, simultaneously. Human settlements thousands of light years apart had all been abandoned at exactly the same time. The precision required for such coordination suggested advanced planning on a scale that encompassed their entire species. The quantum communication networks that Dr. Hyjin Park had developed contained hidden protocols that activated after the human departure. These protocols transmitted final messages to locations outside known space, where human forces had apparently gathered for their last mission. The messages were brief and encrypted, but they conveyed determination rather than desperation. General Seok Jin Choi had left behind tactical analyses of enemy capabilities that defied rational understanding. His reports described entities that could exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously and possessed technology that manipulated the fundamental forces of reality. The weapons required to fight such enemies would need to draw power directly from quantum vacuum fluctuations. The final pieces of evidence came from astronomical observations that human scientists had been tracking for decades. Long-range sensors had detected distortions in space-time that indicated the approach of objects moving faster than light through extra-dimensional space. The calculations showed that these entities would reach the galactic rim within months of when the humans had departed. Veltara realized with growing horror that the humans had gone to fight a war that no other species could survive. They had detected enemies approaching that could destroy entire civilizations with technologies beyond current understanding. Rather than try to convince other species to join a hopeless battle, the humans had chosen to face annihilation alone. The search operation had answered the question of where the humans had gone, but the answer was more terrifying than the mystery had been. The humans were fighting for the survival of all galactic life against enemies that existed beyond the boundaries of normal space and time. Their departure had been an act of ultimate sacrifice to protect species that had never appreciated their contributions. The empty spaces where humans once worked were not just reminders of loss, but symbols of nobility that other species had failed to recognize. The galaxy owed its continued existence to creatures they had dismissed as primitive and emotional. The humans had saved everyone by condemning themselves to a war they could not win. The Council faced the devastating realization that they could only wait and hope that human sacrifice would be enough to protect the galaxy from destruction. They had learned too late that the species they had taken for granted were the only things standing between civilization and oblivion. The entities arrived at the galactic rim exactly when the human calculations had predicted they would. Admiral Zethkara's scout ships detected gravitational anomalies that stretched across entire star systems as reality itself warped around the approaching threat. The readings were so extreme that most instruments failed completely while others produced data that violated every known law of physics. The first contact came without warning when an entire patrol fleet simply ceased to exist. One moment, 12 ships were transmitting routine status reports, and the next moment their signals vanished as if they had never been there at all. Emergency teams rushed to investigate but found empty space where the fleet should have been. No debris. No energy signatures. No trace that anything had ever existed in that location. Veltara watched the reports with growing terror as more ships disappeared throughout the outer sectors. The entities moved through space in ways that made tracking impossible. They seemed to exist partially outside normal dimensions, which allowed them to appear anywhere without warning. Traditional weapons had no effect on targets that could phase in and out of reality at will. The galactic defense networks that had protected civilization for millennia crumbled within hours of the first attack. Orbital stations designed to withstand. Fleet bombardments were simply erased from existence when the entities focused their attention on them. Planetary shields that had never failed before offered no protection against enemies that could attack from directions that did not exist in normal space. Panic spread through the galaxy as worlds fell silent one by one. Communication networks collapsed as relay stations disappeared without trace. Transportation routes became too dangerous to use as ships that entered certain regions never emerged again. The careful structure of galactic civilization began dissolving as isolated worlds prepared for death they could not prevent or understand. Then the human fleet appeared at the edge of the galaxy where the entities were strongest. Admiral Yun Wu, Kim led a formation of ships unlike anything other species had ever seen. The vessels were built with technology that seemed to bend space around them, and their weapons drew power from sources that normal science said were impossible. They moved with purpose toward an enemy that had never been successfully challenged. The transmission from Admiral Hyun Woo reached the council chambers as his fleet engaged the entities in battle. His image flickered with interference from energies. That overloaded recording equipment, but his voice carried clearly through the static. He explained that the humans had spent months preparing for this moment, while other species remained unaware of the approaching danger. The Admiral revealed that human scientists had developed weapons capable of affecting targets that existed across multiple dimensions. The technology required sacrifices that no other species would have been willing to make. Entire human colonies had been converted into power sources for weapons that could damage enemies existing partially outside reality. The human fleet carried the concentrated resources of their entire civilization. Dr. Na Young Song had solved the theoretical problems that made such weapons possible, but the practical requirements were staggering. The energy needed to breach dimensional barriers and strike at entities in their native space could only be generated by converting matter directly into quantum field fluctuations. The process would consume everything within light years of the weapon when it was activated. General Seok Jin Choi coordinated the human battle strategy with precision that demonstrated years of preparation. His forces moved in formations that spanned multiple dimensions while engaging enemies that could attack from directions that existed outside normal space. The tactics required understanding of physics that other species had never achieved. The Dias battle raged across regions of space where the laws of reality became fluid. Ships fought enemies that could become intangible at will, while weapons designed to affect quantum fields tore holes in the fabric of space-time itself. The human fleet used technologies that would have been considered impossible months earlier, but desperation had driven their scientists to achieve breakthroughs that violated conventional understanding. Veltara received fragmentary reports as the conflict escalated beyond anything that had ever been seen before. Human weapons that drew. Power from stellar cores engaged entities that could manipulate the fundamental forces of existence. The battle created gravitational waves that were detected throughout the galaxy as reality itself was stressed beyond its normal limits. The turning point came when Dr. Na Young Song transmitted the activation codes for humanity's ultimate weapon. The device had been built in the space between galaxies where its effects would not immediately destroy inhabited worlds. The weapon would create a barrier that could isolate the local galaxy from the extra-dimensional space where the entities originated, but the energy required would consume everything human. Admiral Hyun Woo explained the choice that humanity faced. In his final transmission to the Council, they could retreat and allow the entities to destroy galactic civilization, or they could activate their ultimate weapon and save everyone at the cost of their own existence. The barrier would protect other species, but it would trap humanity forever in the space between dimensions with their enemies. The Admiral's voice remained steady as he described the human decision. They had known from the beginning that survival was impossible, but they had chosen to fight anyway because the alternative was the extinction of all galactic life. They had detected the approaching threat while other species remained unaware, and they had prepared for war while others dismissed their warnings. The weapon activated with effects that were visible throughout the galaxy as a barrier of pure energy, formed around the local group of star systems. The barrier would prevent the entities from entering normal space, but it would also prevent anything from leaving. Humanity had created a prison that would contain both themselves and their enemies for eternity. The final message from General Seok Jin Choi reached the Council as the barrier sealed. He explained that the human fleet would continue fighting the entities in the space between dimensions to ensure they could never escape. The battle would continue forever, with humanity serving as eternal guardians to protect species that had never appreciated their sacrifice. Admiral Hyun-woo's last words carried across the galaxy before communication with human forces was lost forever. He forgave the Council for their failure to understand and asked only that other species learn to work together as humans had tried to teach them. He expressed hope that galactic civilization would survive and grow stronger without the threats that had destroyed previous societies. The barrier held as reality stabilized around the protective field that separated the galaxy from the entities. Astronomical observations confirmed that the threat had been contained, but at a cost that left the surviving species overwhelmed with guilt and gratitude. Humanity had sacrificed itself completely to save civilizations that had dismissed them as primitive and interfering. The aftermath brought changes that transformed galactic society. The Council established protocols to ensure that no species would ever again be dismissed without proper consideration of their contributions. The Human Memorial Protocol required that all voices be heard and all perspectives be valued regardless of how alien they might seem to other species. Veltara found herself leading efforts to preserve human knowledge and continue their work of protecting other species. The empty chair where Ambassador Tae-ho Kim had once sat was replaced with a memorial that reminded everyone of the price of arrogance and the value of sacrifice. Every council session began with a moment of silence for the humans who had given everything to protect others. The galaxy slowly rebuilt itself using principles that humans had tried to teach through their example. Cooperation replaced competition, as species learned to value emotional wisdom alongside logical thinking. The protective instincts that had seemed like interference were recognized as essential qualities that kept civilization from destroying itself. Children throughout the galaxy learned about the humans who had saved everyone through ultimate sacrifice. They studied human literature and philosophy to understand the emotional intelligence that had made such sacrifice possible. They were taught that true strength came not from superior technology, but from willingness to protect others even at the cost of one's own existence. The barrier continued to glow faintly at the edge of detection where human forces maintained their eternal watch against enemies that would destroy everything if they ever escaped. Sometimes sensors detected energy fluctuations that suggested the battle was still raging in dimensions beyond normal understanding. The humans continued their vigil in exile to ensure that their sacrifice would never be forgotten or wasted. The galaxy survived because a species that others had considered primitive and emotional had possessed the courage to face annihilation for the sake of others. The humans were gone, but their legacy shaped every decision and every interaction between species that had learned too late to appreciate what they had lost. The empty spaces where humans once worked had become sacred reminders of nobility that transcended species boundaries.